Happy Friday, everybody. I hope you've all been enjoying Outlaws of Thunder Junction, and had some fun times watching the Pro Tour last weekend. So the first place winner was Domain, and we saw a very interesting change from what we've seen in your typical Domain lists. So dropping both copies of Invasion of Zendikar. So just to go over the deck really quick before the sideboard guide, we've got 3 copies of Up the Beanstalk, 1 Glimpse the Core, 1 Long Goodbye, 1 Imidane's Recruiter, 2 Spelunking, 4 Topiary Stompers, 4 Archangels of Wrath, 3 Depopulates, 1 Cartographer's Survey, 3 Sunfalls, 4 Leyline Bindings, 4 Herd Migrations, 3 Atraxas, a bunch of your typical fixing, including 4 Cavern of Souls to name Angel. And then for the sideboard, we've got 3 copies of Negate, 2 copies of Chromhost Seed Shark, 2 copies of Tranquil Frillback, 1 copy of Nissa Ascended Animist, 2 Rest in Peace, 3 Long Goodbyes, and 2 Temporary Lockdowns. So with that, I'm going to step through the matchups and go through the cards individually, and see you in a second. Welcome to my weekly Best of 3 sideboard guide. This week is Domain, and specifically the list piloted by Yoshiko Ikawa to take down the Pro Tour. Sorry if I massacred that name. And they had an undefeated victory over 10 matches, and we did see a curious change in the list. So since they decided to drop both copies of Invasion of Zendikar, I do think that we should keep an eye out about whether or not that was a good decision. Similar to what we saw in week 1 of the Standard Challenge when Esper Midrange decided to cut the 4 copies of Wedding Announcement. So we want to keep our eyes open. How often is Invasion of Zendikar coming up? And as usual, what I do is I look at the data on Untapped, which is a tracker that tracks Magic the Gathering data. So let's see if that decision was supported by the tracker data. So if you're new to the series, every week what I like to do is take an archetype and look at how each card is performing against the average deck in the archetype. And I do this by looking at tracker data by Untapped and look at the top 8 most common archetypes in the tournament scene, according to MTG Goldfish. So first up is Esper Midrange, and we saw a big spike, and I'm probably going to continue to see that, but I believe 30% of the field was, or over 30% of the field was Esper Midrange. So top of the list here, we've got Imidane's Recruiter, and Topiary Stomper on down until we hit into no data. And one of the limitations to this approach can be insufficient data. However, one of the things that we can do is look for missing options. So notably here, Invasion of Zendikar is in the top 10 for alternative lists. And then if we can also open up the data to include how the card is performing across all archetypes instead of just specifically in Domain. And from here, we can see we can grab in a little bit more data. So Tranquil Frillback at the bottom, as well as Nissa. And then at the bottom of the list here, we've got Temporary Lockdown and Spelunking. So we could also consider taking out a additional copy of Temporary Lockdown and 1 Long Goodbye to bring in 2 negates, but it wouldn't necessarily be a huge improvement, but you could if you wanted to. So the clear improvements would be to bring in the 2 copies of Tranquil Frillback and the Nissa Ascended Animist, cut 1 copy of Temporary Lockdown, and cut 2 copies of Spelunking. Again, if you wanted to, you could cut additional to bring in Negate. But Tranquil Frillback, this is assuming that the Esper Midrange that you're playing against is running Wedding Announcement and Virtue of Loyalty. And we are starting to see lists that are cutting both. So in the Pro Tour, there was an Esper list that had neither of those enchantments. So don't bring in your enchantment hate if they're running the enchantment-less version. So keep that in mind. And then the Nissa Ascended Animist here is useful as well for artifact or enchantment hate. So again, if they're favoring the Wedding Announcement and Virtue of Loyalty lists Esper Midrange, then we might have to revisit this sideboard suggestion. Esper Midrange does not have targets that get... Esper Midrange does have some good targets that get hit by Temporary Lockdown, like Deep Cavern Bat, Dinnick, Pious Apprentice, Duelist of the Mind, and Fairy Mastermind. So not to mention the tokens off of Wedding Announcement. So the bigger problem is that Esper Midrange can be running enchantment hate like Destroy Evil, Get Lost, and Lauren of the Third Path. Spelunking, on the other hand, is better in matches where you are racing for lands, and not particularly important in this matchup. Next up is Domain, and we can see at the top of the list here is Up the Beanstalk, which is crucial to gaining the card advantage in the mirror match, and it is also a key to losing if you are playing against Jace and the game goes to mill. So keep that in mind. And then we hit into no data relatively soon with this, not a whole lot of data to look through. So notably, Invasion of Zendikar does make it into the top 10, relatively high up as well, so it is a missing option. And then for all archetypes, we can see Temporary Lockdown comes in, which is a good response, as we'll talk about here in a second, as well as Negate, which is a classic one to bring in. And then Archangel of Wrath is down at the bottom, and as well as Long Goodbye. The other options are in the sideboard. So for Domain, I think what the data suggests is that we bring in the 2 copies of Temporary Lockdown and the 3 copies of Negate, take out the 4 copies of Archangel of Wrath and the 1 Long Goodbye, and Temporary Lockdown wipes the board after Herd Migration, and then Negate can be used to hit Sunfall or Herd Migration, as well as, their Planeswalkers. So if they are running Wandering Emperor. So the biggest deal here is to have an answer to their herd migrations, and Archangel of Wrath is more about stabilizing against aggressive strategies and stopping their flying plan, so it doesn't really help us outvalue our opponent, and the mirror match rarely comes down to life totals. Since you can do so much damage in one turn, the Archangel of Wrath gaining the life is usually not that critical to the match. And then Long Goodbye basically hits Topiary Stomper, and that's about it. So we can cut the 1 copy of Long Goodbye. Next up is Boros Convoke, and here we can see top of the list, we can bring in the 2 copies of the Temporary Lockdown, classic sideboard option against Boros Convoke's Go Wide strategy. And then near the bottom here, we've got Spelunking. And for alternatives, we have Buried in the Garden, Ill-Timed Explosion, Lightning Helix, and Courier's Briefcase, which could be explored, less so for Courier's Briefcase, but that was a classic option against aggro decks in the past. But some interesting options that could be explored, and I thought Buried in the Garden especially stood out. And then as far as all archetypes go, the Chromehose Seed Shark could probably make it in as a minimal improvement over Up the Beanstalk. But it is certainly better than the Glimpse the Core and Long Goodbye coming in at the very bottom of the list. So I think the suggestion here is to take in the 2 copies of Temporary Lockdown, the 2 copies of Chromehose Seed Shark, cut the 2 copies of Spelunking, the Glimpse the Core, and the Long Goodbye. And Temporary Lockdown is the sideboard of choice against if you have access to white, against Boros Convoke. And resetting the entire board outside of the Sanguine Evangelist and the Knight Errant of Eos, that is great. So Chromehose Seed Shark helps block early pressure while also developing the board. Notably, its win rate was not above 50%, so it's not as good as Temporary Lockdown, but I do think it will help, and can kind of help us keep up with the go-wide plan of Boros Convoke. Whereas Spelunking, again, we don't need to have the mana advantage in this matchup, we just need to survive, so we can bring the 2 copies of Spelunking out, and 1 copy of Glimpse the Core. Again, not very necessary for ramping, and Cartographer's Survey is probably in this category too, but there was insufficient data. And then Long Goodbye, spot removal doesn't work terribly well against Boros Convoke, as we saw with the sideboard guide for Esper Midrange. Go for the Throat was boarded out, and Go for the Throat even hits Knight Errant of Eos, and Long Goodbye does not, so it definitely belongs in the sideboard for this matchup. Then we got Temur Control, and here at the bottom of the list, we've got Archangel of Wrath. Notably, this is a unfavorable matchup for Domain. And then we hit into no data. As far as alternative options go, we do see Invasion of Zendikar coming back into the top 10. And against the Temur Control, the best option is to bring in the 3 copies of Negate. And our weakest card is probably the Archangel of Wrath. So Temur Control, we could bring in the 3 copies of Negate and the 2 copies of Rest in Peace. Notably, that was not actually represented in the data, but Rest in Peace is definitely a sideboard card for the Temur Control matchup. And then we could cut 4 copies of Archangel of Wrath and 1 Temporary Lockdown. And so negate it does hit their Virtue of Strength if you're going to try to prevent them from getting to an obscene amount of mana, or you can try to hit the World Soul's Rage. Do remember they have ways of looping their World Soul's Rage and can get it back and do like a Memory Deluge and find another one. So notably, as we saw in Esper Midrange, the Rest in Peace is missing as well from the data, but should be brought in this matchup over Temporary Lockdown to stop the Graveyard Landfall loop. And then Archangel of Wrath, Teamwork Control is capable of doing an absurd amount of damage, so the lifelink is not particularly relevant. And then Temporary Lockdown can punish them for playing Shigeki or Aftermath Analyst on turn 2, but the better that your opponent is, the more likely that they will play around this and wait for turn 6 where they can get immediate value off of their Aftermath Analyst. Then we've got mono red aggro, and we've got two temporary lockdown at the top of the list here, so we should be bringing in the 2 copies there. And then we've got Nissa Ascended Animist, which I don't know if this is an artifact in the data, but I definitely wouldn't have thought to bring that one in. And then we've got Spelunking down at the bottom of the list, which kind of makes sense. Similar to the Boros Convoke, we just don't have time to ramp. And then Imidane's Recruiter is not helping very much in this matchup either. And then the missing options are similar to what we saw in Boros Convoke with the Buried in the Garden, Ill-Timed Explosion, Lightning Helix, and Go for the Throat. And versus mono red, for all archetypes, we can see Tranquil Frillback, which is a kind of common sideboard against mono red aggro. And the weakest cards are probably Glimpse the Core and Up the Beanstalk. And then, so I think the strategy here should be to bring in the 2 copies of Temporary Lockdown, the 1 copy of Nissa Ascended Animist with a little bit of an asterisk, and then 2 copies of Tranquil Frillback, cut 2 copies of Spelunking, 1 copies of Imidane's Recruiter, 1 Glimpse the Core, and 1 Up the Beanstalk. And Temporary Lockdown hits most of their threats outside of Squee and Godric. And then Nissa Ascended Animist was a surprising suggestion, since it is difficult to last until turn 5 in the first place against mono red. And then you would have to pay 4 life to even play this on turn 5. But the 5/5s maybe can help and maybe worth the 4 life. I don't know. It's something that I'd like to explore because it is being suggested by the data. And I do know that red can struggle against higher toughness, so you might be able to get something. If you can even get a 6/6 out of this, then you get outside the range of Witchstalker's Frenzy and might be able to stop the onslaught. And then Tranquil Frillback, on the other hand, is a classic sideboard option, and I can stand behind this one against mono red. You can pop it, you can destroy Kumano, but most importantly, you can gain the 4 life. And then Spelunking, again, is about gaining a mana advantage over our opponent, and what we need to do against mono red is just survive. And then Imidane's Recruiter is a terrible blocker as a 2/2 for 3 if you aren't the beatdown, and it's much better when you're trying to give everything haste before a board wipe comes down the following turn. So Glimpse the Core, similar to Spelunking, is about the mana advantage and not survival. So, and Up the Beanstalk is about outvaluing over time, not important in this matchup, especially since you can't afford to take turn 2 off from playing a blocker. Then we've got Azorius Control, and if you remember what I said about Imidane's Recruiter giving everything haste before the board wipe, this is a good example. And then at the bottom here, we have Atraxa Grand Unifier, and Herd Migration. It's difficult to get Herd Migration down because of all of the counter spells, and then if you do get it down, it can be you do need to answer their board wipe as well, or you need to dodge a board wipe. So I think we can look to take out the Herd Migration. In the alternative lists here, we do see Invasion of Zendikar making it back into the top 10, and against all archetypes, if midrange is determined by who has the most creatures on the board, control is determined by who has the most mana. And so this is when it's the good time to have the Spelunkings and the Glimpse the Cores and such. Spelunking is great in this matchup, and notably there is some contradicting data. In all archetypes, it is the #1 card in Domain. Specifically, it's number 4. So either way, it's definitely not worth pulling away from the list. And the real problem here is that there aren't really many great sideboard options for defeating Azorius Control. And Chromho Sea Shark and Negate being our best bet, but still below 50%. So I would suggest we bring in the 2 copies of Chromho Sea Shark and the 3 copies of Negate. So yeah, bring in the 2 copies of Chromho Sea Shark, the 3 copies of Negate, cut the 4 copies of Herd Migration, and 1 copy of Atraxa Grand Unifier. The Chromho Sea Shark, the advantage to playing the Chromho Sea Shark is being able to create incubator tokens off of your leyline bindings, because your leyline binding, even if it's discounted, still gives you a 6/6 incubator token. And what that does is it forces your Azorius Control opponent to wipe the board twice. And Negate can be brought in to counterspell a Sunfall or Planeswalker. It's a classic sideboard option against Azorius Control. And then Herd Migration gets answered by Temporary Lockdown, Depopulate, Sunfall, Farewell, Negate, other counter spells, basically their entire deck. So we can take out all 4 copies there. And then Atraxa Grand Unifier is also pretty easy to answer, and if they are running the mill strategy with Jace or the Realmbreaker Invasion Tree, then playing Atraxa can actually be detrimental. And then last but not least here, we've got Golgari Midrange and Imidane's Recruiter and Up the Beanstalk at the top of the list. Very favorable matchup. One of the reasons why we saw Golgari Midrange kind of disappear was because of Domain. And then Temporary Lockdown is the worst card with that actually has data, but it is still above a 60% win rate. And then alternatives, we notice Invasion of Zendikar again in the top 10. And honestly, there isn't much of a sideboard plan for this matchup since it is already so favored. And if there was something in the sideboard, we should probably take it out because it's not necessary. So no sideboard strategy necessary for Golgari Midrange. You should win that match. And then I'd like to wrap things up here for the overall impressions. And one of the top 8 matchups that was missing in the data was the new archetype 4-color legends at number 7. So we're definitely going to see more of that in the best of 3 tournament scene. And since there were 2 in the top 8 for the Pro Tour, I imagine that we'll be seeing more of it in the future. So Long Goodbye was notably bad against Esper Midrange, Domain, Boros Convoke, Temur Control, Mono Red Aggro, and Azorius Control. And hopefully it is absolutely fire against 4-color legends, especially because there were 3 in the sideboard, and the pros know what they're doing, so those long goodbyes had a target. So I think that if you are competing personally outside of the Pro Tour, it makes sense to maybe sub out the or maybe at least not run 4 copies, unless you are planning on bumping into a lot of the 4-color legends deck, and where I think it is probably a good for that matchup. Notably, cutting Invasion of Zendikar also did not seem like a great idea, but they did win the Pro Tour, so take it with a grain of salt. They may know something that I don't. And Invasion of Zendikar was in the top 10 best cards for Esper Midrange, Domain, Temur Control, Azorius Control, and Golgari Midrange. So I do imagine that we'll continue to see it floating around in future builds. Unlike Wedding Announcement in Esper Midrange, like I covered last week, which I imagine we will actually see cut because the data supported that as well. So I'm curious about running Buried in the Garden over Long Goodbye, personally, at least for climbing the ladder. And since it was a good option against Boros Convoke and Mono Red Aggro, certainly worth keeping in mind if you are adapting the Domain deck for best of 1. So if you've made it to this point, thank you very much for listening to my best of 3 sideboard guide for Esper Midrange. Please let me know what has been working for you and what you think. Sideboards make interesting discussions, and these guides do take a fair amount of time and work, so I have to put together one of these every week. So thank you for those who can support me financially by clicking join to become a YouTube member, subscribing on Twitch, or have joined as a patron. I greatly appreciate your support. And good luck crushing your matches or RCQs, and I'll see you next Friday for another Best of 3 sideboard guide. Take care.